Hi, everyone. You're listening to episode 651 of the People Behind the Science podcast. This week, we are excited to be revisiting our conversation with Dr. Pat Hutchings, which was originally published on October 5th of 2015. Listeners, Pat is a marine biologist specializing in studying a type of sea worms called polychaetes. She examines where they live, what they do, and how diverse they are. And these polychaetes are an important part of the ocean's food chains, and they help break down debris in ocean sediments. Now, Pat shares more about these remarkable creatures and more about herself in this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of People Behind the Science. Today, listeners, I am excited to introduce you all to Dr. Pat Hutchings. So, Pat, thank you so much for joining us. How are you today?
I'm very well, thank you. It's a beautiful day here in Sydney.
Well, I am excited to have you here on the show, and I'm excited to hear that it is a beautiful day there. We're looking at a lovely evening here in St. Louis, Missouri, so quite nice. Well, listeners, let me tell you a little bit about Pat before we dive into our official interview questions. Pat is a senior principal research scientist at the Australian Museum Research Institute. She received her bachelor's degree with special honors from Queen Mary's College of the University of London, as well as her Ph.D. and Doctor of Science in reproductive biology of a sea worm from the University of Newcastle upon Tyne. Pat is a fellow and senior vice president of the Royal Zoological Society of New South Wales. She is also past president of the Australian Coral Reef Society, former councillor of the Australian Marine Science Association, past president of the International Polychaete Association, and former vice president of the Coast and Wetlands Society. Pat is also the recipient of the Silver Jubilee Medal from the Australian Marine Science Association for her contributions to marine sciences. And now, listeners, Pat is here with us today to tell us about her journey through life and science. So, Pat, today we want to get to know you, both as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us a little bit about your life outside of science and how you'd like to spend your time?
I like being quite active. I enjoy sailing. We do ocean racing, although we've recently sold our big boat and bought a smaller one. I enjoy gardening and things like cooking and basically entertaining and travelling and visiting friends.
Well, that sounds like you have a busy schedule there, Pat. I like it. So what's your favorite thing to cook?
I enjoy, I suppose, a lot of vegetable type stuff and lots of fresh fruit and sort of healthy stuff. I've given up making cakes to some extent, but yes, I enjoy good food.
Excellent. I like it. It sounds great that you garden as well. You can just cook stuff fresh from the garden.
Yes.
Well, Pat, wonderful to hear a little bit about your life outside of science. But next we are going to dive into your scientific side. So can you give us a little flavor of how you describe what you do to someone who's not familiar with science or your field?
I basically tell people that I'm a marine biologist who works on sea worms and that I spend time describing new species. I'm interested in where these worms live and what they do, but also how diverse and beautiful they are. But I also, as I'm telling them this story, I watch their body language and see if they immediately look bored. If so, I then change the subject quickly and go on to something else. It's not everybody's idea. They find it sometimes amazing that someone spends their life working on sea worms.
Well, I must say, Pat, I had to look up these sea worms while I was doing a little bit of research on you, and you are absolutely right. Some of them are beautiful. So they run the whole gamut of things from sort of unimpressive to quite ornate and beautiful.
And they also play a really important role in the food chain. They're at the bottom of the food chain. And I always say to people, if you find a mudflat without any worms on, it's an indication that mudflat is heavily polluted and not a good place.
Certainly. Well, wonderful to get a little taste of your research, and we will definitely chat more about it as we go through our interview today. But Pat, I want to talk a little bit about motivation and what motivates you. I know there's so much to get done in a day as a scientist, and really no matter what your career. Is there a particular motivational quote or maybe a saying that you like to keep in your mind to help yourself stay motivated?
I suppose probably my favourite is that I'm unwilling to accept that one cannot do something. There's always a way around the problem. I suppose unwilling to take no for an answer.
I like it. So how does this help you in your everyday science?
Well, I think that there are people out there, even within one's own institution, who say, oh, that's too difficult or that's not possible. There's always ways around it. Okay, we can't spend the money in this way. How can we resolve this issue with finance to transfer those funds to this particular project? I'm quite persistent in those situations.
Well, I think that is a fantastic way to approach things. And I know in science, all different kinds of challenges come up. So definitely being one of those people who finds a solution, no matter how many situations, how many scenarios you have to work yourself through, I think is a really helpful way to get things done. So let's not only talk about what motivates you. I want to hear next about who motivates you. Are there certain people that you can point to who really had a big impact on your career? Maybe people you've looked up to as role models?
Okay, well, I went to an all-girls school in the south of London, and looking back, we had a wonderful biology teacher called Dr. Peach, and she was very supportive of me and encouraged me to apply to Queen Mary College at London, because she said that the zoology degree there was very marine orientated with excellent lecturers. A lot of people who were doing science at school were being encouraged to go on to do medicine. But I realised, I think then, that I really wanted to do zoology. And so I went off to Queen Mary, and she was right. It was a very small class with plenty of practicals and field work. And there was actually only 13 of us in a year. This is long since gone, I know.
Oh, wow, yeah.
So we got to know the lecturers really well. We were a group of people that were together for 3 years. And some of those are still my friends, and I still visit them when I go to Europe or whatever. They also took their teaching very seriously, but also I was introduced to their research. One of our lecturers was a guy called Professor Shaw, who'd worked with Hutchings and Katz, who won the Nobel Prize on working out how action potentials go along the giant squid axons. And Shaw was just so approachable and willing to show us how to do things. They took time to look after their students, and I think it was a very good introduction. It was only later that I realised how famous some of these lecturers were. I mean, this was before the internet. It was far more difficult to find out what some people did. Mm-hmm. So I realised very early on that I wanted to go and do research. And one day I went into college, and there was a note on the blackboard saying, "Well, Pat, go and see Prof." And I thought, what have I done?
Right. Can't be a good sign.
So I went off to see Prof, and he said, "Look, I met this guy at the Royal Society meeting last week, and he's got a NERC fellowship for someone to work on worms up in Newcastle. I thought that you'd be an excellent person to go and meet him." It sounded really good. So I caught the train up to Newcastle. My father paid my train fare because I was a fairly impoverished student. And I met this guy who was R.B. Clark. I didn't realise how important he was in the worm world. And he showed me the lab where I'd be working. He even showed me the sorts of parts of Newcastle where students lived. And he said, "Look, I'm offering you this position providing you get a good degree." So I went back to London and I thought, that sounds good. Sounds a really good exercise. And I like the area. I want to get out of London. So I got my degree. I went up to Newcastle and I joined really what a diverse group of people, all of whom were working on various aspects of sea worms. We got on well. And we helped each other. This was really important because my supervisor, R.B. Clark, was actually head of department, so he was busy doing administration and rarely came down to the lab. But what he would do is about once a month, we would have worm nights at his house.
This sounds lovely.
And he would supply beer and chips. And what we had to do was we actually had to take it in turns to present our research. And people were fairly confrontational as to why you were doing this, why wasn't this working, and whatever. So you really had to believe in one's research and accept criticism, or realise that you really got to explain what you were doing much better than you just had. And I think it was a very good grounding in academic ability to communicate with other people. While they were working on worms, they were working on different aspects of it. And so I've recently had to write the obituary for this guy, R.B. Clark, and Peter Olive, who was one of my co-students with me, said this was a really great idea to have this meeting once a month when we had fun, but it was also, there was a very serious side to it, to make sure that he knew what we were doing, but also that we could tell our friends, our colleagues. So I think that was very influential. While I was at the lab, the University of Newcastle has one of the oldest marine stations in the country in England. I saw an advert for a job at the Australian Museum. Now, fortunately, we had a visiting scientist from the University of Queensland working in the lab that time, and he was very positive about the Australian Museum and its new director. So I thought, well, I think I will apply for this job. And I knew that I wanted to travel. I didn't want to stay in England. I wanted to go overseas. So I applied for postdocs in Canada and the States. But I was interviewed in London by the then director of the Natural History Museum in London, and the director of the Australian Museum had asked to undertake this interview. This was before video conference Skype calls. So I went to this interview and came back to Newcastle after it and thought, God, I really would like that job. It sounds fascinating.
Oh, wow.
Lots of ability to travel, and the Australian Museum sounds a good place. My prof back in Newcastle said, do you really want to work in a museum, Pat? And I said, yes. It's not a fuddy-duddy place. It sounds as though it's going places. They've just got a new young director who's just spent 2 weeks in a submersible in the Caribbean, and they run a research station on the Great Barrier Reef. This sounds a good place to go. So I went back to working up my data for my thesis. Anyhow, a few weeks later, I received a letter. This was before, as I say, the internet, and they offered me a job. But they said, we don't want you to come until you have finished your thesis. So as soon as it was a great incentive for me to get rid of
Right.
this.
It's a motivating force right there.
Exactly. So then all plugs were pulled out, and they managed to get my viva within 2 weeks of me submitting my Ph.D. in Newcastle. Within 3 years of starting my Ph.D., I was on a plane to Sydney. I didn't know a soul in Sydney. So that was an interesting time arriving, but we coped. And I think that what was really good with the new director, Frank Talbot, who'd only been a director for a couple of years. Actually, he went on to become the director of the Natural History Museum in the Smithsonian in Washington. He used to go and invite me out quite often to join his young family sailing around the harbour. He also, I remember coming into my office and saying, can you dive? I said, yes. And so this was fairly unusual for someone coming from England in the early 70s. So within a few weeks, I was on the Great Barrier Reef and hooked, thinking this is much better than learning diving in warm water on coral reefs.
Right, than up in England, yeah. Well, that sounds like a dream job, Pat, and wonderful that you were able to land it. So I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about how working at a museum has been different than perhaps at a more traditional academic institute?
Well, I run occasionally a course in polychaetes. I do have graduate students, but we have to co-supervise them with someone at the university. But I also mentor a lot of students from universities that come and want their animals identified, or they want to know something about polychaetes. I've been involved in exhibitions, but probably what I've done is I've travelled around most of Australia collecting material to build up our collections, because that's what we work on, and it's really important to go to places and collect good collections. So we now have one of the largest worm collections in the world, which is all data-based. So I've really had great fun diving around the countryside, collecting worms. I mean, what else does one do when one goes diving? So I suppose it all sounds fun, but there is quite a serious side in terms of spending time sorting and identifying this material and then publishing it. I have similarities with people at university, but I also have, as I say, some differences.
Certainly. Well, it sounds like the Australian Museum is a wonderful place to work. And it's been interesting to hear a little bit about your journey and some of the people along the way who had a big impact on you. But I'm curious, where did this interest begin, Pat? Can you take us all the way back to the beginning? I know you mentioned you were interested in marine sciences and zoology early on in school, but did you have any interest that preceded that, maybe when you were a kid?
We used to spend our summer holidays on the south coast of England. And I think very early on, I used to really enjoy looking at what was in rock pools, and my parents encouraged me, and I used to collect animals, and I just was interested in the world around me. My parents aren't academics, there's no biologists in my family, as it were. I just became fascinated by the natural environment. And also the school that I went to, it was fortunate that it had extensive grounds, it had a small woodland, ponds, salt marshes and things, so that we were really encouraged to go out in the field and collect and look. And we had, as I say, this really wonderful teacher. So I think that all exposed me to what was out there in the world in terms of the natural environment.
Definitely. Well, I think having these teachers, these professors, really encourage your curiosity and take you out there to explore the world, to really have a look around and see all the fantastic creatures out there is a wonderful way to cultivate your interest in science. And now I'm curious, you mentioned that you went to Newcastle upon Tyne to study sea worms. Had you been already exposed to them previously, or was this your first forays in sea worms?
No. As I say, we were a small group at Queen Mary College. And the then professor used to suddenly say on Thursday, right, we'll go down to the field station. And we had a small field station associated with an oyster facility at Whitstable. And so we would go down there and stay in the nearby pub and end up at Crofts that night for dinner, open up a barbecue. Mm-hmm. But we would basically be expected to walk along the beach and collect animals And each of us would get a group of animals to identify and then show to the rest of the class. And so I got worms very early on, and we were expected to know what was living on those intertidal mudflats and why they were living there and what they did. I have a colleague who's just retired as a professor of ophthalmology at London University, and he used to get the crustaceans, and he said, I can still remember the names of those crabs on that mudflat, even though he hasn't worked on crabs for years. So it was really a wonderful introduction to mudflats. And then we had this lecturer, a guy called Alan Thorpe, who gave a lecture one day about the way that these worms can spawn on one night of the year. And they do this with a brain the size of a pinhead.
Wow.
And worms are one of the lowest groups of animals that have a well-developed hormone system. So they actually can spawn on a particular night of the year. They can work out 6 months before to start producing their eggs and sperm. And I just thought that was amazing. So when I went to Newcastle, that was some of the work that Bob Clark, R.B. Clark, had done. And so I carried on with that, looking at how the worm that I worked on, which lived at 30 metres depth in cold, dark water, would all learn to spawn on the same night of the year in January. And I just found that fascinating.
Well, Pat, it has been wonderful to hear more about your journey and your experiences as you went through your science career path. And I think we've made it sound quite adventurous. And you said there's a serious side to a lot of work to be done in identifying the specimens, but you do get to get out there, do some diving, collect your new species, explore these mudflats. It sounds like a lot of fun. But I know there are challenges that every scientist face throughout their career. So can you share with us one of these difficult times in your career, a moment where you had a major failure or you were really struggling with something? Tell us what happened and how you worked through it to be successful.
Way back in the 1980s, I was invited to go and work in Eilat in Israel over a 3-month period. And I set up a series of experiments to investigate the recruitment patterns of polychaetes, of sea worms, onto coral substrates. The guy that I was to work with, Yossi Lauria, was impressed with what I'd done at Lizard Island on the Great Barrier Reef, and he wanted to repeat this sort of data in the Red Sea. Well, the first problem was when I first arrived at Tel Aviv airport to be picked up by Yossi, he said, well, I've been called up for military service, so my student will have to look after you. So I thought, okay.
We'll make this work, yeah.
Yes. So I went down on the bus and arrived in Eilat. Anyhow, my Hebrew is non-existent. There were a few hassles, but we managed to sort out collecting these blocks of coral or cutting the blocks of coral. A lot of work. They were then laid out onto the reef, and they were to be collected at 3 monthly intervals over 2 years. So after 3 months, I'd left instructions exactly what was to be done. Yossi, by this stage, was back out of his military service, and I flew home. So then I waited another 18 months for the experiments to run their full course. They were then fixed, and then they were to be shipped to Australia. Anyhow, I don't know where, either in Israel or in Australia, the customs or the immigration people thought, oh, this looks really sus, blocks of coral.
Right, questionable.
So they all got opened, and there were labels inside each of these sealed plastic bags. By the time the package arrived at the Australian Museum in Sydney, the blocks were sort of all loose and the labels were all mixed up.
Oh no, disaster. So how did you respond?
Well, not really. I'd never really been able to do very much with those blocks at all. I know that Yossi had paid for me to go to Israel and do all this. And I said, well, there's nothing really I can do. So basically that work was wasted and that funding. So I suppose the next problem that we've had, or I've had over the years, is that because worms are not necessarily high profile, perhaps they're not the sexiest group of animals, I think it's probably been more difficult to find funding for polychaetes than, say, if you work on snakes or koalas here in Australia. Mm-hmm. So it's taken probably harder work to raise funds. And in reality, the museum doesn't have research funds, so all our research funding has to come from external sources. For instance, one project I had, I was really interested to know where worms fitted in, because we don't have a good fossil record for worms. So are they more closely related to the crustaceans or to the mollusks? They're heavily segmented. So at the bottom, they go back to the Cambrian. What was going on eons ago? I think I had to submit that grant 3 times before we finally got the funding. I talked to people on the committee and they said, worms are not that high profile, but eventually we got that funding. So I think it's been a challenge in my entire career to obtain funding. I mean, I've been successful, but I think it's harder to get money for sea worms than the big megacharismatic animals or snakes and things like that.
Certainly. Well, it sounds like persistence definitely paid off in this particular case. And I know this is a challenge that a lot of scientists are facing right now, is just struggling in general to get funding for their work. And I don't know, anyone who doesn't think polychaetes are sexy probably has not seen the Christmas tree worms. Those are beautiful, but...
So I think some of my time has been trying to publicise not only the beauty, but also the importance of these worms. For instance, when the 11th International Polychaete Conference here in Sydney, we managed to coerce some friends of mine who were photographers to give us free some high-quality images, and we had them blown up into big posters. And we just put them into the museum cafeteria, and there was a little bit of text with them, but the general public, their response was, yeah, these are amazing-looking animals. They didn't need to necessarily know what they did. They were just admiring them for their own beauty, and I think that's a good way to start.
Absolutely. Well, listeners, you definitely have to go out, find some pictures of these polychaete worms. Some are beautiful. Some might be a little bit nightmare-inducing, so brace yourselves. But fantastic to hear about some of these challenges that you face in your work. And I know some of these are just disappointments that you, like you said, you can't recover from this instant where you've sort of lost the samples that represented years of work.
You just have to move on in those situations.
Absolutely.
The other thing that I'm finding increasingly depressing is that I've had quite a lot of postdocs in my office, sometimes for 4 or 5 years, and they're really good, but they are struggling to get secure permanent positions. And one of my best postdocs, who's had something like 3 postdocs, is currently unemployed in Spain as of 2 weeks ago, and the long-term future is not looking good. And here is someone in her early 40s who throw away her last 20 years of life working on sea worms. I think is just appalling.
Certainly. Well, I'm really glad you brought this point up, and I think this is going to resonate with a lot of our listeners out there who might be in this stage themselves, maybe going on their second postdoc, starting their third postdoc, and really struggling to find permanent positions. So this is something that at least people out there can rest assured that they are not alone in this struggle. And sometimes you have to be resourceful. You have to be open-minded to different opportunities that maybe at the moment aren't exactly what you're looking for, but just try and find a fit somewhere so that you can ultimately get to where you want to be in science.
One of my postdocs, she's given up and gone into computing science, so she'll never come back. I think it's very short-sighted, not only her time, but the universities that have trained her, and then there's nothing going, and yet there's so much work to be done out there. We still know so little about the polychaete diversity out there, and for instance, we ran a 2-week workshop at Lizard Island after the Polychaete Conference in August 2013. And we're just publishing the results, and we have something like 92 new species.
Wow.
And that's only the beginning. I mean, there's lots of families of worms that we didn't cover during those 2 weeks. There's an incredible diversity out there. And this is just shallow water worms, not stuff living out in the depths where there's an awful lot of undescribed species to be. But it's not just identifying species for the sake of it. It's really trying to understand how those benthic communities actually function. Because if we start to destroy those benthic communities, then we will start to destroy the food chain, the links within the marine ecosystems.
Certainly. And I think it is so important to bring up these issues and to bring up the issues about careers in science and jobs and the struggles that are going on right now. And really important to talk about those to raise public awareness, but also to give people a whole picture of what life is like as a scientist and the things that you face. So Pat, thank you so much for sharing these challenges with us today. But we don't just want to talk about the tough times. We're going to make you share a happy story with us. Can you tell us about one of your successes? And this can be a big success in science or even one of these small victories along the way that just really meant a lot to you.
Okay, back in 1983, I decided we'd never had a meeting of worm people around the world. We'd never had an international meeting. The museum had run an international fish conference, a crustacean conference. And so I thought, well, surely we can run a polychaete conference, a seaworm conference. So earlier that previous year, I'd been around through the States and into Europe. And I asked a few of the leading researchers, saying, if I was to host a meeting in Sydney, would you come? And they said yes. So I came back to the museum and I said, right, I am going to run the first International Polychaete Conference. And we ran that in August 1983. We had something like 90-odd participants from about 15 countries. I was able to introduce some researchers to each other. They knew of their own work, but they'd never met one another. Mm-hmm. at the end of that meeting, I then took a group of them up to Lizard Island for 2 weeks, and they really enjoyed working on the reef. But what happened at the end of the meeting in Sydney was there was a movement and said, this has been such a wonderful week-long meeting. We need to have these meetings on a regular basis. And so the guy called Jürgen Kierkegaard from the museum in Copenhagen said, I will run the second International Polychaete Conference in 3 years' time in Copenhagen. So that's continued. Every 3 years we've had a conference somewhere in the world, Iceland, China, Brazil, the States. And so we were in Lecce in 2010. And I thought, well, okay, perhaps this is my swan song. I ran the first. Why don't I run one 30 years later? Mm-hmm. The word got around the group that I was planning to host a meeting in Sydney in 2013. And we actually vote on choices. Anyhow, other people who were planning said, no, we'll come to Sydney. Uh-huh. So I came back from the meeting in Lecce and said, right, Sydney is on for 2013. So we basically set about raising funds to bring people in, not only senior researchers to give the plenaries, but also to encourage students to come, to run workshops on biological systematics, on invasive species, and then also to run a 2-week workshop at Lizard where we were actually going to document the fauna. So I think that's been a major contribution, and it really brought people together, not only the senior people but the youngsters who could then meet. So you had several generations of researchers talking to each other, working together, developing collaborative programs. And I think a lot has flowed from those international meetings.
So was the 30-year meeting, Pat, just as exciting for you as the first year?
I think it was exhausting, if nothing else. Yeah. But yes, I mean, by this stage, I had an organising committee. It wasn't just me. We also were able to do all the registrations through the internet. We had a lady who ran that side. Yes, we were really successful. But basically, we had a week of workshops, a week of the conference, 2 weeks at Lizard. At the end of those 4 weeks, I was exhausted. There's no two ways about it. But it was a pleasant exhaustion that you felt you had achieved something. But it doesn't end there. You've then got to get the proceedings published, and we did that within 18 months. But I am looking, we're going to Cardiff next year for the 12th. I'm looking forward to sitting there and doing very little.
Gotcha. Well, Pat, this sounds like a phenomenal success, and so exciting to hear that this initiative that you got started, this International Polychaete meeting, really took off and people got behind it and started hosting the meetings on alternating sessions. So I think this is a great success and wonderful that so many people in your field were excited to join you on this endeavor.
I think I just saw a niche and it's worked. It's the only international conference that's basically devoted to worms, and people find these small meetings with no concurrent sessions a very constructive way to communicate. You just come in the morning, pick up your coffee and go and sit down. You don't have to decide which session you're going to go to.
I think making the choices is the hardest part. I can never decide. There's always two at the same time.
Exactly.
Well, Pat, wonderful to hear about this success story, and congratulations to you on this exciting success. And we talked a little bit about your life outside of science, Pat, and I love getting ideas from the people we have on our show of books that I can recommend and books that I should add to my own reading list. So, Pat, I'm going to ask you today to give us a recommendation. Can you tell us about a book that you've read and really enjoyed and you think we should check out?
Well, I have to confess, I don't read too much during work time, except during holidays. But we recently went up to New Caledonia and I really enjoyed reading a book by Richard Flanagan, The Narrow Road to the Deep North. It's based on the true story of a medical practitioner who was in the military and who was captured by the Japanese and had to work on the Burma Railway during the Second World War, and how he was allowed to retain his medical, trying to look after his fellow prisoners, although he had very little equipment or medication. And it was just very well written. It's won some major awards, but that's not part of it. It was just well written and you couldn't put it down once you started.
Gotcha. Well, I am a sucker for those books myself. I know I like to try and read when I'm on the train going to work in the morning, and sometimes it's hard to put the book down when you get to work. Like, I want to keep reading. So I'll have to add this to my list, and listeners will put this out on the website for you to find as well. And Pat, we've talked a little bit throughout your discussion of your career path about these different places you've been able to travel for science. And I think as a scientist, travel is a big part of the job. So can you think back on all the places that you've been and tell us about one of your favorite destinations for science?
There's no doubt the Kimberleys in northwest Australia. Back in 1988, we managed to raise funds from various mining companies in conjunction with the Field Museum in Chicago They were going to sort out the land snails on all these little islands along the Kimberley coast, and we were going to work underwater. And so we chartered a boat from Broome up to Wyndham, and we basically spent 4 weeks going up that coast. It is just so unspoilt, remote. It was just an amazing experience, and I'm desperately trying to get back there. It's a coral reef area. It's quite a dynamic system. It has 4-metre tides. It has a few problems in terms of the crocodile population and tiger sharks and things, but it is basically remote. It's also relatively unspoiled. Unfortunately, there are quite a lot of proposals for big mining explorations up there, but it is still an amazing place, and just the scenery and the landscape is spectacular.
Well, it sounds absolutely beautiful, Pat. You're painting a wonderful picture for us here. And I'm curious, since you've been, like you said, out diving and you've done some exploring of these coral reefs yourself, have you noticed any changes over the years in places that you've been able to go back to?
Unfortunately, yes. There's no two ways. I mean, just the increase in algal cover, but it's interesting comparing, say, some of the better reefs on the Great Barrier Reef with those in places like French Polynesia, where you have overfishing, you've had crown of thorns, you've had bleaching events, and there's no big fish left. It's really quite depressing at times.
Certainly, and I think this is one of the challenges perhaps too in your field of almost maybe feeling futility, because there's not a lot that you can do to stop some of these changes. So definitely a struggle. Well, Pat, wonderful to hear about some of the travel that you've been able to do and some of the exploring you've been able to do. And I think a big part of the science career that we haven't yet talked about are some of the people that you get to work with. So there are so many brilliant, funny, dynamic people, I think, that make up these laboratories. And in all the different laboratories that you work in over the years, I think there's different personalities, different traditions that define them. So can you think back and all the different groups of people that you've worked with over the years, Pat, and tell us about one of these big traditions that you remember, or just a funny or fond memory you shared with colleagues.
Well, I've been fortunate enough to work with people from the Smithsonian, and I've spent time down in Caribo, in Belize, and also an expedition we went to Aldabra. And I got to know people, not only as colleagues, but then became friends. I've been to some labs where I don't really want to go back, but certainly it's just a collaborative program and working together.
Certainly. So have you brought the tradition of worm nights back to where you work now?
Not quite, but we certainly work together and we play together here. And only last week we thought we are going to celebrate getting the Lizard Island volume to the printers. And so a group of us went out to lunch. And we did not bother to come back until probably about 3:30.
Oh, wow. That's an excellent lunch.
I mean, we basically just, what I find really good is that many of my earlier students and postdocs have become basically not only good friends, but also my colleagues now. It's a nice community. I'm not saying that all worm people get on, but an awful lot of them do. And it makes life so much easier when you send them an email and, can you help me with this, or can you look after my student? And they will, if they can. Those personal contacts are really important. It's also, my husband is a businessman, and he finds it really weird when we travel but we don't stay with these colleagues. Mm-hmm. The way that our funding is, we cannot afford to stay in hotels. It's much better to stay with people, and then you can continue working, continue talking, and getting to know them.
And then you have a host to show you the city as well, which is great.
Yeah. A friend of mine who has recently passed away, Christian Froschald at the Smithsonian, he would say about 3 o'clock, look, I'm going home. Why don't we go home now, and we'll bring that manuscript you've got there, and we'll sit at home over a wee scotch, and we'll go through this manuscript. And for me to have this guy's undivided attention for a couple of hours going through it was extremely important to me and very beneficial.
Definitely. Well, Pat, I think you brought up a lot of great examples of the culture in science and some of these opportunities that you get to work with phenomenal people, not only your mentors, not only people who you look up to who are helping you out with these things, but also the people that you're training who are then going to become your colleagues, your peers, and collaborators. So great points to bring up, Pat. And it's been wonderful to talk a little bit about your research and the work that you're doing and the important role of polychaetes in the world. But I want to know now, if we gave you everything, if you could ask whatever big question you had in your mind, if things like funding and staff and technology and feasibility were not standing in your way, Pat, what is the question you would want to answer?
I'm still really interested in the relationship between the various groups of worms. Where did worms come from? If we had the funding to really look at the relationships between the 20-odd thousand different species of polychaetes, the relationship between the families. There's a few places in the world that I'd still like to go diving and collect. So I think I haven't had a bad innings. I've still got lots of work to do, but I want to basically try and ensure that the next generation of worm people have the opportunities that I've had to continue this work.
Certainly. So, Pat, where are these places that you're still hoping to dive in?
Well, parts of I quite like warm tropical waters. We recently had a week's holiday up in Papua New Guinea, and there's lots of work to do up there, and it would be fascinating to go back.
Fantastic. Well, great to hear about one of these places you aspire to visit, Pat. And I think you're right. There's so much work to do in science in your field, but in so many fields. So there are great opportunities, listeners out there, if you are interested in starting your own career in science. And we talked a little bit about your career journey and some of the people who've helped you along your way. And I think in science, there are so many opportunities to work with great mentors, to work with great people, and just get excellent advice. So we like to pay these opportunities forward to our listeners by sharing some advice with them on the show. So, Pat, can you tell our listeners maybe what you would consider the best gem of advice is that you've ever received?
Oh, I think just to follow your passion. One doesn't do this to earn a fortune. One does it because one is passionate. One gets excited by looking at these animals, and that's what drives one. The thought of going to the office from 9 to 5 and just pushing pieces of paper sounds really boring.
Right.
I have no intention of doing it.
Gotcha. Well, I know, having had an industry office type job myself, it was a struggle. You need to have that passion to keep you going in every day. And I know scientists put in quite a few hours at work, so it is really helpful to have something that you are excited about and passionate about to go in to do every day.
It's like trying to do your finances for some grant. It's really boring. And you think, God, I just want to finish this and get back to looking at what I'm supposed to be doing, looking at my animals. I'm not very good at paperwork, I have to confess.
Well, understandable. I know it is part of the drudgery side of science, though, some of the things that you have to do that you don't love, but it allows you to do the things that you do love. So great piece of advice, Pat. Now, can you share with our listeners any last parting piece of advice or a last note of inspiration that you'd like to end our interview on today?
I think it's really great if you can have a lab of young postdocs around. I mean, I have learned so much from my postdocs, and hopefully they've learned something from me too. But that sort of interaction, that collaboration between people of different generations, they've learned new techniques. I mean, I'm really thinking about perhaps I should go back and do molecular biology for a term or something to learn something about all the sequencing and things. So it's a process of continual learning, and I think we need to break down barriers and not have a hair doctor professor at the top and youngsters at the bottom. It should be on an equal footing within the lab.
Well, I like it, Pat. I think this academic hierarchy can be frustrating for a lot of people. And you're absolutely right. The learning oftentimes goes both ways, with people who you're training in your lab, teaching you new things or bringing new skill sets into the lab. So great point there. And Pat, it has been wonderful to chat with you today. Can you tell our listeners where they can go if they want to learn more about you and your fantastic work?
If you go to the Australian Museum website, there's a search button on that. You can get access to my bio and my recent publications, and you can find out some of the things that I'm doing. And also we write periodically blogs about, we have a system now where when you publish a paper you have to write a blog for the social media to catch on to these publications. So really the Australian Museum website's the best place.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, check out that website. Find some of those blog articles out there to read more about Pat's research. And Pat, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing a piece of your story.
Thank you.
Pat, it was a pleasure to chat with you, and listeners, pleasure to chat with you today as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to seeing you next time on People Behind the Science.